On March 3, 1945, a 21-year-old Navy fighter pilot on a mission over the Pacific was shot down by Japanese artillery. His name might well have been forgotten, were it not for the remarkable, some might say unbelievable story of a little boy named James. But then, when he was 2, the planes James loved suddenly began to give him frequent and frightening nightmares.
I'd wake him up and he'd be screaming, and he'd always be laying on his back, kicking his feet up at the ceiling. And I'd say, "Baby, what were you dreaming about?" He'd say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out."
They sound like typical kiddie nightmares, but Andrea says they went on the same way for months. Maybe too much TV. But James was just 2, and his parents say only watching Barney and Teletubbies.
Teletubbies!
No, that one.
So what explains the nightmares and James's strange obsession with airplanes?
I talked to my mom about it a lot of times, and my mom had said maybe he's remembering a past life.
What did you say?
Politely, baloney.
Having a past life is not the initial conclusion that you come to. You try and figure out any other way he could have. Did he see anything? Has there ever been anything on television, anything that we've discussed?
But as time went by, Andrea didn't know what to believe. Here's James at age 3, going over a plane as if he's doing a pre-flight check. He would continue to say and do things that were puzzling, like the time his mom bought him a toy airplane.
And I said, "Oh, look, there's a bomb on the bottom of it." He said, "That's not a bomb, Mama, that's a drop tank."
A drop tank?
I'd never heard of a drop tank. I didn't know what a drop tank was. He said, "What happened to your plane?" He said, "It crashed on fire." And Bruce said, "Why did your airplane crash?" And he said, "It got shot." And Bruce said, "Well, who shot your plane?" And I'll never forget the look on his face. He went, "Oh, the Japanese!"
Still, despite these extraordinary stories, Bruce remained dubious. Almost to prove they couldn't be true, he began to piece together the details James was sharing. And what he found, he says, shook him to the core. For in many instances, the stories appeared to match the facts. James seemed to be recalling real events, real people, in the life of a man who'd been dead for almost 60 years.
Bruce had always said, "What kind of plane did you fly?" And he said, "A Corsair."
Yeah.
He said a Corsair?
He said the word Corsair.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did James remember flying a Corsair, he demonstrated knowledge of the plane's peculiarities, like the time he was flipping through a book about planes when he was 4.
And he got to the Corsair, and he said, "That's a Corsair." And he goes, "You know what? They used to get flat tires all the time."
In fact, historians and pilots agree that the plane's tires took a lot of punishment on landing. Of course, this is a fact that could easily be found in books or on TV. But then, James began to offer up the kinds of specific details his parents say are harder to explain away.
Another night, Bruce had come in and he said, "Do you remember where your plane took off?" And he said, "It took off of a boat." "Do you remember the name of your boat?" "Natoma." "Do you remember what your name was?" And he'd always say, "James." But his name is James. It never really occurred to us. We thought he just wasn't understanding the question. So I said, "Do you remember any friends or anyone else that you flew with?" And he said, Jack Larson.
Bruce began doing some research. Almost immediately, he discovered that the Natoma was an actual ship, a small aircraft carrier in the Pacific called the Natoma Bay. And Jack Larson, the Navy buddy little James recalled? Well, it turns out there was a pilot named Jack Larson who served aboard the Natoma Bay. In fact, he's alive and well and living in Arkansas.
And it was like, holy mackerel. I mean, really, you could have poured my brains out of my ears. And I just couldn't believe it.
And there were more clues. Around this time, James began signing crayon drawings and other artwork, James 3.
One day I asked him why he's calling himself James 3. It was because I'm the 3rd James. And every once in a while you ask him that today and he'll still say the same thing.
And one day, while leafing through a new book about the Battle of Iwo Jima, Bruce turned to an aerial photo of the Pacific Island. James was seated nearby.
He pointed to it and he goes, "Daddy, that's where my airplane was shot down." And I said, "What?" He said, "That's my airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And I just went blank. I couldn't say anything.
By then, Bruce had become a man possessed, searching the internet, combing through military records, and interviewing men who served aboard the Natoma Bay. Finally, a breakthrough. He learned that there was just one pilot from the squadron killed at Iwo Jima. That pilot, James M. Houston Jr. Is this why little James was calling himself James III?
It just crystallized in my mind. This has to be who we're talking about. You know, my meter of skepticism was starting to go over toward belief.
When little James would describe being shot down, he told of how his plane had sustained a direct hit on the engine.
We had an airplane, and I said, well, can you show me where it was? And he pointed right up to the front of the engine.
That's what makes this man's story so intriguing. His name is Ralph Clarber. Clarber was a rear gunner on a TBM Avenger that flew off the Natoma Bay. On March 3, 1945, he took part in a raid near Iwo Jima. As it happens, Clarber's plane was right next to the one flown by James M. Houston Jr. It was to be Hugh's last mission before leaving for home the following day. As Clarber recalls, the sky was thick with enemy flak.
We experienced pretty heavy anti-aircraft fire, but this was the most intense that I experienced at any time.
Suddenly, a flash near the nose of Houston's plane.
I saw the hit. I would say he was hit head-on, yeah, right on the middle of the engine.
Just as little James had described it.
So what do you believe now about your son James?
I believe that he had a past life. I believe that in his past life he was James M. Houston Jr. And he came back because he wasn't finished with something. And that's essentially what I believe.
Dear